Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Raja Javaid.
Hey Tom, how are you?
Yeah, I'm okay, thank you. So Raja, I wonder if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit more about your current role and what brings you to this discussion around AI, please.
Yeah, sure. So I am the Chief Information and Transformation Officer at the University of Warwick. Just very briefly, my career prior has been about circa 27 years in the private sector, brands like Dixons Stores Group, Boots, Rolls-Royce, and IAG. And what brings me to this discussion is a general interest, both at a personal and professional level, of the disruptive nature of AI. It's really caught the interest and the imagination of many people, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years, but has been in existence in several ways and several capabilities for decades. I've seen AI have a disruptive nature in manufacturing, engineering, in retail, and other sectors that I've operated in, and it's really becoming quite real in this sector. And I think it's an interesting topic that you lead into.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it'd be really interesting to get your perspectives today on education, but as someone who hasn't been in education for their entire career. I think you have a unique set of perspectives to be able to offer, particularly to be able to balance the different perspectives of organizations, institutions, both public, private, and then third sector as well. I wonder, Roger, if we could move on to the first question. So, what do you think are the most exciting advancements in AI that you've seen recently, either in an education context or outside?
Yeah, I mean, there's several, but the ones that really have caught my interest, and I would suggest have also caught the interest of the sector, is the advancements in generative AI and large language models. So, for instance, ChatGPT, DALL-E, Midjourney, and they've transformed industries, I would say, over the years, like marketing, content creation, design, enabling people to generate text, images, music as well, at an unprecedented scale. Another major development in healthcare, for example, companies like DeepMind, created AlphaFold, which can predict protein folding and advancements and implications for drug discovery, as an example, treatment of diseases like cancer. We're hearing a lot about that, and Alzheimer's as well. And also autonomous vehicles, such as those, Tesla would be the obvious one that comes to mind. How they're integrating into daily transportation, self-driving tech. The impact of AI is becoming more entwined with everything that we're doing. If I take generative AI and GPT as an example, I would describe GPT as the iPhone moment for AI, where it really started to kind of catch on the interest, irrespective of where you sit from a demographic perspective, from an age point of view, whether you're a student, whether you're an academic, researcher, or somebody in the professional services, in terms of the back offices within a university, how you can use GPT to support on multiple fronts, whether that's curriculum development through to how we do, I don't know, in HR, job profiles, creating job profiles. It's taking or providing a simpler way on some of the tasks that would have taken much longer. And I find that really fascinating and really exciting, because if we can harness the power of tools like generative AI or NLP, natural language processing, for the betterment of the sector, I think will allow us to be more creative on focusing on research and driving the education agenda even further.
Yeah, and I think that particularly what came to mind as you were talking was the idea of it would allow us to work smarter, perhaps, and not harder. And I think a lot of what we do within the higher education sector is very time consuming sometimes. And if AI can help give you an hour or two back a day, that's transformational, and it allows you to perhaps focus on things where you can add value in your context. So for me, in mine, if I got an extra hour or two a day, I can go and speak to more students. I can go and spend more time with them, get to know them, get to be able to understand how to support them, and whether that's in the modules that I teach or just as part of being in the department. And you definitely can see the benefits that can come with that. I really liked your point as well about the iPhone moment, and I hadn't heard that kind of expression before. But one of the things we've spoken about on the module a lot with students is the history actually of AI, or algorithms, let's say, and automata, if you want to go further back in time, and actually that you obviously have the development of AI from the 1950s onwards. You have AI winters, you have popularity spikes and drops as well. But I think you're right. This feels like one of the first times that perhaps the technology is meeting the hype, and that's perhaps what separates it from previous times we've in the 60s and 70s and 80s where we had these massive hype cycles of people saying, "Oh my goodness, AI is going to allow us to do this with expert machines, or it's going to allow us to do this with machine learning," but technology couldn't quite back up the claim. I think that technology has allowed us to do some of these things, has also created issues though, where for AI to be able to do some of these more challenging functions, it has to be more complex. With complexity comes a lack of explainability. And I think the ability to explain how these systems work, particularly in education, is going to be key about how are we showing both students and staff how a decision has been reached. And it extends outside of education as well. And you mentioned around some other areas of kind of AI for good. So thinking about how they link to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And you mentioned about healthcare. One of the key themes that keeps coming out is how do we make these almost explainable, to an extent democratized, so that people can understand why they're reaching those decisions. And then there's also, some other challenges as well around ethics and bias. I wonder, thinking about all that, whether you'd like to talk about what you see as perhaps the biggest challenges facing AI development today as well.
Yeah, I think there's I would split it down into a few really. I think the first one is the ethical AI development. These tools, these capabilities derive itself from the data it's fed, and that data historically is not AI creating it itself. In all cases, it's deriving information from humans. From information that we feed on a huge scale, and therefore our natural biases would also creep into the way AI learns. And a good example of that, or an example, I should say, a good example, an example of that was Amazon. They had to scrap an AI hiring tool um, as they started to discover it was discriminating against female candidates. And the reason it was doing that is because it had trained on CVs submitted mostly by men. Now, there's an ethical element that we've got to consider because it is learning from the historical biases and norms and the prejudices that, without kind of getting deep into our psychology, that we have as humans. So there is a challenge there that we need to look at, that we can't blindly rely on AI, I don't believe, in this stage. We need to determine its viability and its ethical responses, or its responses under an ethical code, for want of a better term. Another example is data privacy. There's another issue for us to consider. I mean, AI systems, as I'm sure you and the listeners will know, requires vast amounts of data to learn and improve, and there is a growing level of concern, in various sectors about how personal data is collected. How is it stored? Is it growing? Um, there's an example, I think, of an analytics scandal. I can't remember the specifics. Being used unethically for data mining and influencing elections. There were whole kind of many debates that have occurred around that. And finally, then, from an ethical perspective, is its scalability and energy consumption. What we're not really appreciating, or I'm not hearing enough of the discussion, is actually as you're amassing that vast amount of data and the computational power that's needed, particularly for examples like GPT-3, GPT-4, etc. It's immense, the amount of computational power that's needing. Well, what's the implication on the environment as a consequence, right? Because you've got to host these on data centers. Data centers take electricity. It's how are we determining the value that AI gives versus the impacts on the climate, as an example. So I think there's several. I mean, I pick those as examples, but there are several areas that I think we need to have a rich debate on. We need to start to understand what our approach needs to be on these topics, and start to provide kind of a AI code of ethics. And this is something that we're looking to do in the University of Warwick. So we've created an AI centre of excellence, and one of the many streams of work is looking at how would we use AI in Warwick, and how do we use it ethically? How do we ensure that the policies that we provide our students, our academic, our research community, our professional services community, enabling them to get the benefits of AI, but leveraging it in an ethical way. So not an easy one to fix, but definitely one that I think we should be looking at as a hot topic. I think as AI starts to become more and more integrated into our way of life.
And I think that's the key word, is integrated. And you mentioned in your answer about not just letting AI replace certain aspects of things we do. And the way that we speak about it to the students is very much, we want you to become AI enabled. We want you to, but within that, we want you to be critical. We want you to be able to reflect and think about what are the challenges with this technology. How do we, as you say, use it ethically? How do we apply it in the correct context? Because actually, if you look at some media representations of AI, it's very much, you go between two ends of the spectrum. You have AI utopia where everything is done by AI and it works brilliantly, which is probably unrealistic, through to super intelligence where we all live in a kind of post Terminator style world where everything is controlled by AI. And I know why they exist, and we can understand why they're popular on Twitter because of how social media algorithms work. The reality is we'll probably be somewhere in the middle, and I think a key part of responding to the challenges that you've pointed out is that ability to be AI enabled, so understanding how prompts work, but actually understanding as well the energy consumption, the challenges of data. And I think a great thread that I saw going through all of your points was thinking about who maybe isn't in the room for these discussions. Another thing we speak to students about is the issue of nations from the global south who are potentially, they could be on a lose-lose platform. So not only do these things not represent their interests unintentionally, just by the way they're built, and you mentioned about bias, but then they're having to deal with some of the climate outcomes as well. But something else I really like that you pointed out is the challenge of AI systems themselves. And if they are a reflection of us as humans, you mentioned about the kind of innate bias and stereotyping that we have within us, but taking away the kind of some of the coding around words like stereotype and bias, they are part of our survival mechanisms in some contexts. And we as humans rely on those to be able to know, well, that car is going, I can see it's going at that speed, so I'm just going to understand that won't hit me if I cross the road. It's that kind of processing that we make. But I think the next step as well comes from, we as humans make decisions based on not having all the data quite a lot of the time. We're very good at extrapolating from a few limited points, but we're creating AI to use as much data as possible. Well, that isn't how we decide things.
Many use cases or discussions, I should say, big pun, on how much could we rely on AI. And there's two examples just churning in my head that may be interesting to discuss. I think the first one is when you pick up a calculator. You imagine when the calculator was ever created and it was able to do, take the basic calculator, simple addition, subtraction, division, etc., all that good stuff. There was no contention or debate. What the calculator told you was the answer, and the scientific calculator came on. What it tells you is the answer. We need to be a little bit cautious, I think, in terms of our reliance on AI, that we don't see AI in the same way, because it has those innate biases too. It is derived, it's learning from us, in effect, humans, what it scouts from the internet and stuff. And so therefore there are a degree, and the term I often hear is AI hallucinations. We'll end up creating aspects that aren't strictly true. So I think particularly for the individuals that will rely on AI, we just need to ensure that we don't look upon it in the same way as we do a calculator, which is quite binary. It's right, wrong. It typically is right. AI can be, I say, wrong in quotes in some ways, and the way to characterize that, and it's a really poor way, because I'll use kind of a pop fiction example, but I'm always been interested in movies or sci-fi movies, and particularly iRobot. And there's always this one particular scene where the lead character, played by Will Smith, has an aversion to these robots, because in this one particular incident, the robot saved an adult over a child in this sinking car, because it worked out and assumed that the adult would have a higher the higher degree of survivability than the child. Now, a human probably wouldn't do that. The human would pick the child, because actually, that's the natural, I assume, the natural mode that a human would take, right? Say, the whole concept of women and children first kind of thing, right? So there is an interesting part, and I remember there were discussions when Tesla started talking around the autonomous vehicle. If the vehicle had to make a decision on who it would save, what would it base it on? Would it make the same decision as a human? And on several tests, it did the opposite of what a human would do, because it mathematically assumed a level of outcome rather than using emotion or things that innately make us human. So I think there's a whole interesting level of debate on our reliance and at what point do we draw a line, because AI at this stage it's not mature enough to fully replicate the human, in every facet. It can't display human emotions. It can't make decisions based on emotions. It will base it on logic and data.
I think what you're saying is really important, and you use the word mature, and I think it's that recognition that currently AI, artificial intelligence, is itself a bit of a misnomer because it's not artificial, because we've made it, we've programmed it with, as you say, our own biases, our own inherent stereotypes, and we've it's a reflection of humanity, for want of a better term. But it's also not intelligence in the way that we would perhaps understand intelligence either. It's something else. It's in some cases with ChatGPT and others, it's just predicting the next most logical letter, which brings us back to the iRobot point that you made of it's not thinking in the way that we would think and understand what intelligence means. And it really makes me reflect on how we need to begin to understand ourselves in relation to it. So you said about, humans would make a very different decision than an AI would make, but it's how can we effectively use AI to enable us to make better decisions using our own inherent value of our emotions and our ability to see the world in the way that we as a species see it. And again, this is why I find all these topics so interesting, because we're talking about the use of AI now, and we've not once gone really near data sets in the last couple of minutes. We're talking about emotions and feelings. It's not a way that you wouldn't talk about a calculator in that sense. You would say, "Oh, well, if we need a calculator had to have more feeling." It's like, no, no, no. I wonder though, Roger, at this point, thinking about your experiences both at Warwick and previously before you joined, how accessible do you think this AI technology is to kind of the general public and wider businesses as well?
If I segment two groupings, as end users and as businesses, in terms of businesses, AI has been around for decades. It's not new stuff that's just landed. Yes, it's caught the imagination, as I said earlier, particularly around the kind of the iPhone moment of GPT, so to speak. But AI has been around. I mean, I worked at Rolls-Royce, and there were several machine learning algorithms that we were doing around data and engine design and kind of product design. I know in retail in terms of customer segmentation analysis, analytics, predictive analytics, predicting the weather to some degree, in terms of some of the data points that have been used over the over the years is a form of AI, and IBM's Watson technology has been around as far as I know, and it's still some of those modules are feeding some of the more newer and more effective, I should say, AI tools. So I would say they've been around for quite a while, and particularly things like Google Cloud, Google Assistant, Alexa. I should be careful because my Alexa will go off if I say anything beyond that. Um, the chatbots, a lot of this stuff has been around, for as far as I know. And the other examples are Spotify, Netflix. How does it recommend you the next song that you should listen to? It's using a form of listening habits and algorithms to determine the kind of songs or the movies that you would like to watch next. So I would say, it's been around for a while. In terms of the sector, as in the education sector, I think less so. It is of course being used. It's feeding those back end search engines. To your earlier point, but has it really had a meaningful impact? I go back to probably one of your earlier questions, which is generative AI. I think is now becoming more disruptive to the sector because just by inference, it creates the ability for our students and our academic communities, etc., to generate stuff, which is AI prior would be more around process automation or using algorithms for data analytics and so on and so forth. So I think it is quite accessible. And if you think about kind of mobile devices, you know, whatever people's views are on Apple, but Apple are PRing their next big change on their phone to be around Apple Intelligence, and when you've got a mass install base, as Apple have, it makes this stuff more and more accessible in everything that we use. So I'd say yes, it's been accessible, probably behind the scene, but it's definitely becoming more real. And I think we will find it being integrated into things that we do and things that we use. The final example is I need to buy a new washing machine, which I'm sure the listeners will be interested in. And Samsung are selling me or trying to sell me this AI powered washing machine. I mean, I don't think it actually puts the washing in the washing machine or do anything with it. But yeah, I think we're going to see it integrated into home devices more and more over the coming years, and will become an additional assisted tool in everything that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a shame it can't put it in for you and then hang it up. That would save a lot.
Yeah, correct. Line it afterwards.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder then. You mentioned about businesses and with Samsung in that case. Not picking on Samsung, but just because you mentioned them, it makes me think about kind of a lot of the topic really we've been discussing has been how do we as a society come to think about that future. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind reflecting a little bit more on how we as individuals, how businesses, and then how governments actually can work together to effectively shape that future of AI. Because you'll know within in the context at Warwick, governance is a really difficult thing to do well and also in the right moment. And I think AI poses so many challenges where, because of the nature of how we create governance and how things go through different meetings and approval systems, by the time you get something through all of those, the next version of ChatGPT is out that's just blown out of the water everything you've just created. So the AI Center of Excellence that you mentioned as well is a really interesting example. But I wonder if you've got any reflections on how those individuals, businesses, and governments can work together.
It's really, really, really good question. So the in the work that we've been doing around the AI Center of Excellence, one of the strands of work, as I touched on around kind of ethics and policies, is how do we align ourselves to what's happening around governments, as an example, and how are countries coming together to think about how AI is leveraged, effectively. One of the approaches I've taken as a starter for 10 is looking at what the OECD are doing in this space, so Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. There's about 30 countries that are members of this, including the United Kingdom, US, Europe, etc. And they have 5 strands that they've looked at as principles. They were adopted in 2019, and they are inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. So any AI deployments need to have, these 5 policies being looked upon or assessed against, if I may use that word. So inclusive growth, human-centered values and fairness, transparency and explainability, which I know you were talking about, kind of explainability earlier, robustness, security and safety, and accountability. Now, interestingly, that's not to suggest that is governed to all those businesses, but what they're looking to do is kind of bring those policies to life. And there's lots and lots and lots of content for the listeners to read. I mean, we could probably talk about this for the next 3-4 days, but there is a recognition that the countries need to come together at a governing level so that when businesses, e.g., like an Apple or a Samsung or a Google or whatever, are developing these AI capabilities in products and stuff, they need to be aligning themselves to those principles. Now, from a COE perspective, in terms of what we're creating in Warwick, we're leveraging the OECD principles as a starter for 10, not suggesting that it applies universally, but actually those 5 things that I've described, I mean, who would disagree with them, right? If you look at it, would we disagree that the way we use AI, whether you're a student, a researcher, or an academic, drives for inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being? I don't think anyone would challenge that. Human-centered values and fairness, we've touched on that. So we would, of course, want to apply our utilization of AI for that reason. We need it to be transparent and explainable. We've touched on that. We want it to be robust, secure, and safely used, so ethically used. And we need to ensure that if we are using it, we're accountable for how we leverage it in the right way. So we're looking at those as an umbrella. And what we want to do is then develop our Warwick flavour to that, if that makes sense, that says, okay, well, what does that mean for us? So I think it's going to become more important for the sector, the education sector, to leverage industry standards. I say industry, but government standards that are applied across all industries.
Yeah, and you've really well articulated there how it works on those different levels, how you get from government to business and organisation, and then the role of the individual actually within that, and reflecting on my role as an academic and actually my role with my students about how do I teach them, how do I feed up and feed down, so to speak, in that chain. be really interesting to see where Warwick goes with that. I think particularly in the context of other institutions, which I know have almost put blanket bans on some of this. They've just said, no, we're not using AI, and that's a legitimate position for them to take. But it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out across the sector and where we end up. But I think the values that you pointed out from the OECD, you can't disagree with those. If anyone did, you'd think, oh, why? What's the reason? And I wonder, with those in mind, because I think they're an amazing starting point. If just to bring us to a close, really, you could reflect a little bit more on what you think are the most important steps that we, whether that's we in education, we as individuals, but the most important steps that we can take to ensure a positive future with AI.
Well, I think, Tom, this podcast and the podcast that you're leading and the work that you're doing is exactly what we need to do more of, right? We need to create education and awareness. I think it's so important that people need to understand AI, not just from a technical standpoint, in terms of, well, how does AI work? How does it learn from data and all that kind of good stuff, but really from an ethical perspective. And as you've quite rightly highlighted earlier, the thread, the golden thread of this conversation has kind of centered itself around ethics. It's centered itself around kind of human emotions, kind of emotional intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. How do we bring that aspect of the humanness into how we leverage AI? So I think it's really important that we do the good work that you're doing, scale it, discuss it with other respective academics, research, students, and let's really get together, because I think the beauty of this is it can help us, I think, accelerate and create the space for us to do some of the more creative stuff that I don't think AI can fully do. I know it can do some creative stuff, but there are still limitations. I think the other one is collaborative regulation. I think that's going to be essential. The OECD, as I touched on, has created AI principles to guide responsible development globally. But actually, what's the work that Microsoft are doing around their AI ethics? How are they partnering with a Google? With a Tesla, for example? All these different organizations need to come together and not try and look at this as a how do we make money out of this, but actually how do we come together to ensure that we're leveraging it for the greater good, right? And I think there is a lot of good work underway, by the way. I'm not suggesting Microsoft, Google, and others are not working collaboratively. I'm well aware that they are, but let's start to publicize what they're doing, and let's start to discuss what they're doing and how does it influence. I think the third is building inclusive AI is what I'd call. So IBM has developed a toolkit. I think AI Fairness 360. I don't know if that's something that you've touched on. And it helps really developers detect and mitigate bias in AI systems. So back to the earlier point that I was talking about in terms of the bias. So how do we use that open source tool to empower the business, the communities and the developers to create fairer, transparent AI? And then finally, I would say we need to promote sustainability in AI. Companies like Google and there's others, they're leading the way with their commitment on renewable energy for their data centers. Back to my earlier point around the computational power that's needed for AI to be effective. How do we look at creating energy efficient AI models? And I think that's going to become something that we should take as AI embeds itself into our day-to-day life. And I think, if we can not necessarily address, but start to have those kind of discussions, I think it will start to become quite helpful in the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we speak so much in the university context about collaboration across departments, interdisciplinarity, co-creation with students, co-production, and everything we're talking about is that. We're talking about the need to do that, and that AI could allow us to do that. And I think it's really exciting to hear what's happening at Warwick, particularly in those spaces. So I just want to say thank you so much, Roger. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. It's been great to speak to you and understand more about your perspective from both inside HE and outside of HE, but also what you're working on now. So thank you so much for joining the podcast.
No, thank you very much, Tom. Really appreciate it. Thank you.